Parashas Miketz is going to be one of the most fantastical stories ever. It's just absolutely incredible. I mean, what you're seeing over here is the plot. Yosef with his brothers. It's unreal. There's so much juice in this parasha. But when you learn the parasha, here's the question. So Yosef comes in front of Pari, and Pari's got these dreams. Doesn't know what to do. So Pari is looking. All the Khartoumim can't figure it out. And then he comes in front to Yosef and he says, Yosef, what do you think? And Yosef says, well, you know what? You know why you had 7 fat cows? Must be they're fat because they ate, because there's plenty of food to eat. And you know why there's 7 thin cows? Because they didn't eat and they're hungry. So that must be a hungry time. You know why the 7 probably represents 7 years? Makes sense, right? Cows are like, each cow represents another season. And the same thing applies to the kernel of wheat. And then he says, and you know why the dream happened twice? Because it's going to happen quickly. So it seems very simplistic. I mean, it's like a story that you would tell, sorry for saying it, in kindergarten. You tell it to little kids and you say, this is what it means. And I wonder, as an adult reading the story, like, why didn't anyone else think of this? Why were they saying, you have 7 girls you'll have, or 7 kingdoms you'll conquer, and then 7 kingdoms will conquer you? And Pari is listening and he says, none of it really fits. That doesn't make sense to him. So how come Yosef was the one who could figure it out, no one else could? Now, this question's probably been thought of by most people, and most of us give an answer, I think. It is that, hey, it's just a story. What happened was, Hashem wanted Yosef to become the viceroy, to get the position. So therefore he made them all dumb, unable to think, and he gave the wisdom to Yosef. But that's nice, but then the story doesn't really fit. It's not an intelligent story, it's like a fairy tale. And then comes the bigger question, or another question, which is, I don't think we understand what it means to stand in front of a monarch. Like, we know presidents and prime ministers, people are elected officials who don't have any real power, because they're there for a few years and then they're gone. And a king, a Pari, has absolute powers. Yosef standing in front of Pari, and he solicits a position without any embarrassment. He says, Pari, it's a good idea. Maybe there's someone who is brilliant, and maybe, someone should be gathering the food. And hint, I'm not saying it should be me, but it might be a good idea. And Pari's like, oh my gosh, you're the most incredible person in the world. You be the one to do it. How do you solicit a position in front of an absolute monarch like Pari? It's very difficult to understand, to appreciate that someone would do that. So I want to share with you a beautiful vart from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he explains the parasha, makes so much sense, just fits in. So you know what happened, why Pari couldn't figure out the dream? Why none of the Khartoumim of Pari could figure it out? Here's what happened. There was one detail in the dream that they couldn't figure out. When they heard the dream, fat cows, they said, good years, thin cows, bad years, double up the dream, it's because it's happening swiftly. They knew all that. And when Yosef comes in front of Pari, and he says, this is what it means, they were all looking at him and saying, are you taking us for fools? You think we couldn't figure that one out? The issue was one little point in the dream which made no sense. If you look carefully, it says that the 7 fat cows come out, and then v'ta'amodna eitzel parot al sfat hayor. They stood together with the thin cows. And then by the shibolim, it says the same thing. They were standing together. If it means 7 years and 7 years, one thing about time is that it happens consecutively. You can't have 2 types of time together. So how do you get the 7 years and the 7 years together? That detail was the core of what bothered Pari. Now you try to figure that one out. Pari comes and he says, I understand, I get it that it means 7 years, but if it means 7 years, why were the 7 good years and the 7 bad years standing together? And this is why they couldn't interpret it to mean that it's going to be 7 good years followed by 7 bad years. So they were like, okay, we have to have 2 experiences together. So they said, well, maybe it means that you can have 7 daughters, and you have a lot of wives, 7 daughters will be born, 7 daughters will die. So you know how it is, death, the tragedy, Rahman al-Islam, overrides any feeling of happiness. That makes sense. Then they told them, oh, you mean 7 kingdoms, things that can happen simultaneously. Yosef comes along and he says, I have something to prove to you. I'm going to show you how it can happen simultaneously. The time and the time. How do you get it to be together? Here's the answer. You see, it says in Golus, when we're in exile, Hayinu kecholmim, we're like dreamers. It's possible for a Jew to be both holy and unholy. It's like two windows in your computer at the same time. It's a paradox. Only Yosef is able to have that. Yosef is, no one recognizes him in the parasha, right? Because he's this holy tzaddik, and yet he's in charge of the whole Mitzrayim. How do you reconcile the two together? That's because Yosef has the power to interpret dreams. He has the power to be holy and inside the world, with God and the world at the same time, simultaneously. So when Yosef gets the power, he says, I'll tell you how. Because you're going to have the plenty and the famine at the same time. That's because when a person has plenty of food, but he's thinking about about a famine, so he's gathering food because he's worried about being poor. And then when he's poor, but he still has the food from before. So that's why it happens together. Well, Yosef wasn't soliciting a position. The solicitation of the position was the interpretation of the dream. He's saying, when someone does this and gathers this together, therefore you're going to have them together. And this is so powerful because this is what's happening at the dawn of Golus. Yosef is saying, we're all, Am Yisrael is going to go out to Golus and it's going to be impossible. You should know that in those impossible odds, the people of Israel will survive anything. We are a living example of this paradox of Am Yisrael forever, Am Yisrael Chai, impossible to destroy the people of Israel, and yet we're part of Golus. So we're part of it, and yet we rise above it. That's what it means. The seven fat cows, the good and the bad, are standing together. And ultimately, the good prevails as a result. You needed a Yosef, only a Yosef could interpret it. And every year when we read this parasha, it's added power to explain to us how we can get through this Golus and bring about a Geula, because, hey, you can override contradictions and paradox with the power of Yosef.